Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, brothers and sisters, salam alaikum, and thank you for the introduction. I've got a few slides I'd like to share with you, hopefully nothing too tedious or nothing that will take your time up more than necessary. So, first of all, I should clarify the question for today. So, the question is, how do we acquire religious knowledge? And this question can be interpreted in two ways. So the first way, we're in a Muslim community center, would be how do we go about acquiring Islamic knowledge? Which madrasa, which hawza do we go to? Do we go to Qom? Do we go to Cairo? Do we go to Najaf? Do we go to Damascus? And when we get there, do we go for a traditional program, or do we want a degree, some sort of bachelor's or some sort of certificate? The question I'll be answering is not that question. The question I want to ask is, I want to look at what knowledge means. And then I want to apply that theory to the religious context. So how do we... So by how do we acquire religious knowledge, I mean, what is religious knowledge? What is knowledge? And once we find out, then what can we do about getting it? And the reason for this topic is a topic which means a lot to me, and as religious believers, I guess it means a lot to all of us. So we want to reflect upon our beliefs, we want to reflect upon our religion. Otherwise, the alternative is blind faith, which is not necessarily a positive thing. So let me begin by discussing where I'm coming from. So my philosophical tradition is called analytical philosophy. There's lots of different types of philosophy. We have Indian philosophy, we have Chinese philosophy, we have African philosophy, we have Islamic philosophy, but we also have Western philosophy. And these different traditions ask different questions, but sometimes the same questions. And they have different traditions. Some overlap, but some similarities and differences as well. So I'm working in the Western tradition of philosophy, and that has two schools, one being the analytical school and one being the European or continental school. So the analytical philosophical tradition, it's in the path of thinkers such as Gottlob Frege, who was a mathematician, a logician, Bertrand Russell as well, who was a well-known philosopher, and also Bertrand Russell's student, Ludwig Wittgenstein. So these were the people that gave rise to this tradition. And the tradition focuses on linguistic analysis, on thinking about the meaning of concepts, the meaning of words. So for example, knowledge. What does knowledge mean? So there's many concepts which we find are just common sense concepts. And if we ask someone, what does knowledge mean, or what does belief mean, or what does God mean, or we find it difficult to give explanation. So we try in analytical philosophy to look into these concepts a bit deeper and come up with explanations. So as I say, it's distinct from continental philosophy. So there's two schools in Western philosophy, one being analytical, one being continental. So analytical philosophy is mainly found in the English-speaking world, so England, America, Australia, and other parts of the place as well, of the world as well. So let's turn to knowledge. That's the topic of this talk. What is knowledge? Or one of the subtopics. So there's different types of knowledge. Like I say, we're analyzing. So what does knowledge mean? There's different types of knowledge. So one meaning of knowledge could be knowledge how. So knowledge how to cook an egg, how to fry an egg. And there's a joke among Iranian husbands, Iranian men, that they all know how to fry eggs because when their wife is away, they have to fry an egg. So there's knowledge how to do something. And then there is knowledge of. And this is to do with acquaintance. So I've got knowledge of the person who gave birth to me, and that's my mother. I've got knowledge of the person who married me, and that's my wife. So there's knowledge of. But I want to focus on knowledge that. and we call this propositional knowledge. That's the sort of technical term for it. So knowledge that it's raining outside. Knowledge that that rain is good for the garden when it's been sunny for so long. So let me look a bit more at this knowledge that, or propositional knowledge. So we've got different types of knowledge. We want to focus on knowledge that, but we want to ask the next question, what is knowledge that? What is propositional knowledge? So the traditional explanation is that knowledge is justified true belief. So if a person believes something, and that belief is true, and the person is justified in holding that belief, then it's said they have knowledge. Seems pretty straightforward, yeah? So to give an example, I believe that North Harrow tube station is the closest tube station here, and I have checked online. I've turned on the location setting on my mobile phone. I've checked the map. I've lived here for long enough. I should know that North Harrow is the closest tube station to here. And I verify it by calling TfL up and saying, I'm at this place, where is the closest tube station? And they say, yes, it's North Harrow. So I've got a true belief. I've done a lot of research, so I'm within my rights to believe that. I'm justified. So you could say, I know that North Harrow is the closest tube station. So another example would be how to spell the word liaison. Does it have one I or two I's? So I check the dictionary. I make sure it's a British dictionary because I don't want the American spelling or whatever. I check that it's a recent dictionary because I don't want 200-year-old spelling. I check that it's an authentic dictionary and not someone's playing a trick on me, or it's an English dictionary, not a French dictionary, and so on. So once I've done these checks, I can be pretty sure that I've got a belief, and then I ask someone who's an expert, and they say, yes, liaison is spelled L-I-A-I-S-O-N. It's got two I's. So I have a belief. I found out that it's true, and I'm justified in holding it because I've done my investigation. So this is what we're talking about. Propositional knowledge, knowledge that something is the case. But we can think of some problems with this account of knowledge. So if we say knowledge is justified true belief, or the JTB account of knowledge, we can think of some cases where this does not apply. So for example, if I am looking at a clock and I see the time is 8:45. So when you look at a clock, that's how you tell the time, yes? So I'd be justified in holding that belief. And it is 8:45. However, it happens to be the case that the clock is actually broken, and it's just by chance that I'm looking at the right time. There's a few clocks in Harrow which are broken. For example, Morrison's. The clock outside Morrison's is not always working. So you could have a look at that clock and think, the time is 8:45, well actually the clock is broken. So you've got a true belief, and you're justified in holding it because you've looked at the clock, which is a normal way. But it's just true by chance, because if you'd looked 5 minutes earlier, 5 minutes before, you would have seen that the clock was broken. So we can think of a few more examples along this line, just to sort of find problems with thinking about our normal beliefs. So we have an intuitive belief about what knowledge is, justified true belief, but we can find examples which throw this into doubt. So another example would be that if I read a newspaper report which has a weather forecast for Canterbury. Canterbury is a city in Kent, about 50, 60 miles away from here. I'm affiliated to the University of Canterbury. So I read a weather report and for Monday, let's say, next Monday. And it says it's snowing. And we know it's midsummer here, so how is it going to snow next Monday? But I trust the newspaper. So I say, I form the belief that it's going to snow next Monday. So the belief is justified. And as it happens, it does snow. A freak incident, it does snow on Monday. Now, wouldn't it be funny if that newspaper forecast I was reading was not Canterbury in Kent, but Canterbury in New Zealand? So when it's summer here, it's winter there. So I read the wrong newspaper report, but still I had a true belief. And this is just one of those funny philosophical arguments which make us question our beliefs. So if we're saying knowledge is justified true belief, but then we have knowledge by accident or by luck, well, we wouldn't call it knowledge anymore. There's one more example I'd like to share. So say, for example, if there's a big a fad in Harrow that lots of people like to get protect their homes. We all like to protect our homes. So we install intruder alarms, burglar alarms. But we can't afford burglar alarms, so the salespeople that are pushing this, they get fake alarms. They get everyone in Harrow to buy fake alarms. You know, just a box outside the home, a yellow box on the front of the home, but it's got no electronics in. It's just a fake box. It looks like a burglar alarm to some people. And then some nasty people come from outside of the borough, let's say, where do we not like? Somewhere outside the M25, yes? So people in London are funny about outside the M25. So some people, nasty burglars from outside the M25, come to Harrow and they see these boxes everywhere, these yellow boxes, and say, oh, and they target a house and say, oh no, it's got a burglar alarm. Where, as a matter of fact, as a matter of luck, that was the only house in Harrow that had a proper burglar alarm. All the rest of them had fake burglar alarms, but this one had a proper burglar alarm. So the burglar had a true belief. It was justified because it looked like a burglar alarm, but it was true by mistake, by accident. So maybe you can think of your own funny examples. I've given 3. So just funny examples how true, justified belief, although we might think that's enough for knowledge, in some cases it's not. So what's the significance of this? The significance is that if we want to give an account of religious knowledge, or say, how can we have religious knowledge, then we should know what knowledge is. But our intuitive understanding of knowledge, that knowledge is justified, true belief, falls apart. So what do we do? Well, different people come up with different solutions. Different people come up with different solutions, and there's 2 that I want to look at in particular, and these 2 relate to religious knowledge. And then we can move on to thinking about these and wrapping up. So the first position that I want to look at is evidentialism. So this is the view that for knowledge we need to gather evidence, and this is from a famous Scottish philosopher of the 18th century, David Hume, and he takes a very robust stance. At the end of his work on an inquiry concerning human understanding, he says, if we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, so if we take any religious text, that's what he's saying, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? So does it have any maths in it? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? So does it contain any science in it? No. And if it doesn't contain these things, commit it then to the flames, for it contained nothing but sophistry and illusion. So he was very hard on this. If it's not maths, it's not science, and it must be make-believe. It must be fairy tales. Well, as religious believers, we don't want to believe that, but some people do. And people that want to acquire knowledge by gaining evidence for their religious beliefs, they might think like this. So another thought about evidentialism is another well-known philosopher. He has said, it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. So the point he's making is that if we want to have religious knowledge, we should get evidence for it. And again, he makes a very strong statement to say that. And the example he gives is of a ship owner who has a cargo to take, let's say, from London to Sydney, a long way across the ocean, across many oceans. It will take days, if not months, to get to the other side of the world. And he knows his ship's a bit old, and he knows the cargo's a bit heavy, but he says it'll be all right, let it go, we'll get to Sydney somehow or other. And he doesn't investigate. And lo and behold, the ship sinks, and all the poor souls on the ship, they perish in the mid-ocean. No one to save them. The cargo goes down, and the ship owner claimed his insurance money. So he's okay, he's fine. But those poor people have perished in the mid-ocean, taking someone else's cargo. And they have families, they have wives, they have parents, they have children. And the moral of the story is that the ship owner didn't do his investigation. He should have investigated whether the ship was seaworthy or not just pretended it was, not just had faith that it was okay. He should have investigated, he should have acquired evidence. So there's a belief that to gain religious knowledge, we need to have evidence. And that evidence is taken to be evidence from sense perception, so from seeing, from hearing, from touching, from tasting, from smelling. So that's one source of evidence. Another type of a source of evidence is introspection. So if I know that I know that I am happy just by thinking about it, or I know that I'm in pain just by thinking about it. So there's certain sources of knowledge that are very clear and very direct. And so these we can take. According to people like Hume, according to people like Clifford. And we can also justifiably believe things which are derived from these logically. So if I say I am in pain, therefore it is a good idea I take paracetamol, well, that's a justified belief because I've logically inferred the belief that I should take paracetamol from the very real pain that I'm feeling. So this is one approach. One approach to acquiring religious beliefs is to acquire evidence and to investigate and to reason based on that. So picture a detective, for example. A detective, for example, wants to find out who did the murder. So there's a murder mystery, and a detective, Columbo or Miss Marple or whoever your favorite detective is, sets about seeing who did the murder. So they speak to people, they look at the scene, see if any items have been left, they take pictures, they speak to eyewitnesses, and different things like this until they solve the mystery. So acquiring religious knowledge, according to some people, is detective work. You have to gather evidence, you have to speak to experts, you have to read books of experts, that's testimony. You have to think about it yourself. You maybe have to do your own experiments. For example, on the human mind, the mind is a big part of being conscious, yes? We have a brain, so we have to know how the brain works. So speak to psychologists, speak to religious experts about what religious scriptures mean. So all these different things about acquiring evidence and gaining a picture so that we can decide what religious beliefs we want. So the advantages of this method is that it's intuitive. If we want to find out something, we go about obtaining evidence. That's quite a natural way to behave. Just like a detective doesn't work by astrology or by looking in the stars. They work by evidence, through perception, through thinking, and so on. But one of the another of the advantages is not that just it's intuitive, but that everyone agrees upon it. So we have so many different religions in the world. We have Islam, we have Christianity, we have Buddhism, we have Hindu religions. We have smaller tribal traditions, we have Judaism, and so on. So how are all these people going to, can all these people be right? If not, then different people have to present their arguments. and they have to think about them and discuss them and launch investigations, and each person has to launch an investigation and see who is right, based on sources of evidence and that everyone agrees upon. So everyone agrees that the sky is blue. So we can all agree upon that, and then we can perhaps use that as evidence to suggest that something else. Or everyone agrees that the world has existed for a long time. So we can use maybe fossil records and argue from that to the existence of something or other. So evidentialism is good because different people can talk to each other about things. Just like in a court of law, you have one side and you have another side, and they argue, and you see who is right. So religious people can do that too, and to see who is right, and to see who has knowledge. But one of the cons, one of the disadvantages of this method is that it doesn't necessarily lead to certainty. So we like to be certain about our religious beliefs. But when we're talking about evidence, we're talking about probability. And when we're talking about assessing evidence, you know, it's very rare that you say, oh, I'm 100% certain. It's more like more probable than not. So in a court of law again, at least in this country, the judge never decides that the person is guilty 100%. So that is not the bar, that's not the standard. So when the criminal or the accused in the dock is never tried against a standard so high that he is certainly guilty, but rather it's more reasonably the case that he's guilty. It's beyond all reasonable evidence. It's probably the case that he's guilty. And the same with religious beliefs. So if we're going to gather evidence, we have to be comfortable as religious believers that our evidence is only probably true. So we gather evidence for Islam, for example, as Muslims, but it's unlikely the evidence is going to be so good that we can be 100% certain that Islam is the correct religion. Okay, let's say 95%, but still that's not really what religion's about. You know, can you imagine the top scholars saying, I'm 95% certain that Islam is true? Or let's look at a different religion. If you can imagine the Pope coming out in St. Peter's Square and saying 95% Catholicism is the correct way, 5% doubt, but 95% surety. That's not how religion works. So this is one of the advantages of this evidentialism approach. So it might seem intuitive, might seem obvious, but that's not actually how religion works. So there is another way that we can look at, and that's called Fideism. So usually when I'm discussing Fideism, I make everyone take the coins out of their pocket. I won't make you do it, but you can if you like. And if you examine it, hold it up to the light, squint a little bit, you'll see Elizabeth II, FD. So FD stands for Fide Defensive. Fide Defensive being defender of the faith. The point is that fide is a Latin word for faith. So fideism, as is on the screen now, is to do with faith. So put aside evidence, put aside investigation all to one side. Let's just go with faith. I know for sure that Islam is true, or the Pope knows sure that Catholicism is true, just based on faith. And reason is good for science, but not for religion. Religion is not the domain of reason. So how does such a scheme work? So there's different types of fideism, many different types, but I want to focus on one in particular. And some people will say it's not fideism, but I think it is, so I guess I win today. And it's called Reformed epistemology. So epistemology is to do with knowledge, to do with beliefs, to do with justification. And there's a school in this analytical philosophical tradition I'm looking at called Reformed epistemology. One of the leading advocates is someone called Alvin Plantinga. So Alvin Plantinga says that religious belief, so Alvin Plantinga is a Christian, so he says belief in the existence of God is not something you reason to, it's something you reason from. So it's not like you have an investigation, you gather evidence, and then come up with a belief that God exists. It doesn't work like that according to him. So he says it's just something given, it's something basic. So just the same way that I see a camera before me and I see an audience before me, I see a piece of paper before me, I see that I've spoken for 25 minutes and that still some of you are awake and some of you aren't. He says the belief in God is just as basic for him, just as genuine, just as fundamental, just as foundational for him. So that's why we call it Fideism, because he's putting this faith first. And he goes on to say that even very specific Christian beliefs, say like belief in the atonement, a belief in the incarnation, belief that Christ died for our sins, and all these sort of Christian beliefs, he goes on to say that we can hold them as basic too. So we don't reason to them, we don't gather evidence, we just believe them, just like this. And he says the way to do that is that, say, a Christian can read the Bible and then they feel that God is talking to them, or they feel moved by the Holy Spirit, and that experience, that counts for something. And that experience gives them a justification in their belief. Or for example, someone could go to climb up a mountain and they have a beautiful scene in front of them and they say that I know that God is great and I feel that God has forgiven me of all my past trespasses. And that feeling that they have in that moment, that's just they're justified in holding that, according to Plantinga. And Plantinga goes on to develop this account. So while other philosophers are saying knowledge is justified true belief, Plantinga will say knowledge has to have a few more criteria for something. A true belief has to have a few more criteria for it to be knowledge. So he says it has to be produced by a properly functioning cognitive faculty, and I'll explain this, where the functioning is determined by a design plan. The design plan has to be successfully aimed at truth, and there have to be no defeaters. That's quite a mouthful. So let's look what he means. So our bodily functions have a normal limit. So for example, heart rate, normally say like 60 to 80. There's some doctors in the room, I think that's about correct. I'm on fairly safe ground. Maybe when we're exercising, it goes up to 120. If you're very fit, maybe even higher. Something like this. Now if my heartbeat was 20 beats per minute, that's not normal. If it was 200, I'm sitting down, I'm resting, we're among friends. If it was 200, that's not normal either. There's a range to what is normal and what is properly functioning for human. Similarly, when it comes to our mind, there is a range of properly functioning, what is normal for a brain to think, or what for a mind to think. So if we have certain cognitive faculties that come up with certain beliefs, and those beliefs don't have any objections to them to show that they're obviously false, so that's when we would say that we have warrant, and that's where we can go on to say we have knowledge, according to Plantinga. So I'm reminded of somewhere I worked once. It was a factory which produced a chemical that went in paint. So it was like titanium dioxide. It was a pigment. And we were told a story that one of the workmen had been there many years. He could flick this pigment onto his boot and instantly know what the density of that pigment was. Can you imagine just flicking something on your boot and knowing how much it weighed? So he could do that because he'd been there 20 years, 30 years, or whatever. So he had a process which was working for him. So according to Plantinga, we can have that person that was flicking the pigment on his boot and who knew how much it weighed, the viscosity of it. So he had a process that was working for him, but he didn't necessarily know how he was doing that. He just managed to get this process. So according to Plantinga, we can get religious beliefs like this. So someone can have religious beliefs, and they can be true, but they might not actually know how it's working, but it just is. Okay, so I mean, we can have an Islamic version of this, so we can say that someone has a pure fitrah, and if they have a pure fitrah, then they're having pure beliefs. They don't necessarily know how they're having them, but they're having them. So that's what an Islamic version of this would look like. There's an objection to this that's been made to Plantinga, and it's called the Great Pumpkin Objection. So when I was small, I didn't watch Charlie Brown, but maybe some of you did. And in Charlie Brown, I believe there was a belief that the Great Pumpkin would come every Halloween and give sweets to all the kids. And so if we're going to just believe in Christianity, or just believe in Islam because we have these special feelings, then why can't we just believe in anything? Like the Great Pumpkin comes every Halloween to give us sweets. So this is one of the objections that are made. You might not find it plausible. I don't find many people believing in great pumpkins, but maybe a few people do, and for those that do, they might be warranted in that. But okay, let me wrap up a little bit. So I've talked about analytical philosophy, and this is what I'm doing, this is the tradition I'm working in. I don't want to overplay this, but just give some background. So I said about Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein. So again, I don't want to overplay how important they've been in this school, but it's just to give a flavor of the school that I'm coming from, because different philosophical traditions will take slightly different views on some of the things that I've said, and maybe ask the questions in different ways, or have different discussions. I've also discussed about the JTB account of knowledge, the justified true belief account of knowledge, and looked at how it might be intuitive, but there also might be some cases where it doesn't quite seem intuitive. And then I've looked at evidentialism versus fideism. And so the sort of things that I've been talking about are largely discussed by Western philosophers. And many Western philosophers are either Christian or atheist, but in some way or other they're very influenced by Christian thought. But similar discussions do go along among Muslim philosophers. So evidentialism, for example, we would have Ibn Sina, he would give an argument for the existence of God. Or we would have other philosophers who have other arguments for the existence of God. So they've gathered evidence to argue for the existence of God. They've been evidentialists. And similarly, we've had Muslim fideists as well. So one of the fairly recent schools in Iran, Maktab Tafkik, which is literally the school of separation. So separating the domain of reason from the domain of faith, and saying we should really proceeding by faith and following the Quran and the Hadith and not really philosophizing. So we've had that as well. So there are Islamic examples for what I've been talking about as well. But to give my own opinion, and just to wrap up, there's a lot to be said for evidence, and I think we have to take it seriously. We do have to investigate our beliefs, we do have to find evidence for them. But there's also something to be said for faith and for personal religious experiences. And I wanted to share an experience with you. For me it was interesting, and maybe you might find it interesting too. So the reason I chose to do this talk today, or chose this topic, is because I was also asked to do a talk on Monday that just went. And I was asked to do something on epistemology. And so when I was asked to do a talk here, I thought I'd just do the same talk again. As it happens, that talk on Monday was postponed. And it was interesting why it got postponed. So I got an email from the person saying it's all set, you know, can you check your bio, can you check the talk, you know, the venue's in a pub, come along at this time. And I go, hang on, I'm not quite happy with a pub. And I'm thinking, you know, I've just met, this is by email, I'm just not happy with a pub, you know, I've just met him, but, you know, I don't want to set a bad impression. You know, maybe it's not actually a pub, maybe it's like a coffee shop with a bit of alcohol in the corner. What else? Maybe it's better that I go, you know, and there might be a bar there, but it's better that I go than not go. But no, I thought, I'm not having any of this. That's my red line. I'm not giving a talk in a pub. So I sent the email off and went to bed. And then the next day, in the morning, I checked my email, and the person said, the pub has burnt down. The talk is cancelled. And he sent me a video link to the BBC, and lo and behold, the pub had actually burnt down. And he gave a link, and he said at the end of the talk, perhaps this is God talking. Perhaps it was. Thank you for your attention.
So what? We have some time for some questions. Do we have any questions? Should we start?
Assalamu alaikum, Amir.
Assalamu
I found the talk, thank you very much. It was very interesting, intriguing, and I hope the EC facilitates a series of lectures to continue, because I think this must be just an introduction, yes?
Yes.
So I would welcome, if you can come back.
Thank you.
And particularly your little snippets or examples, I found that very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Just before I ask a question, you probably will recall the same kind of thing happened to Durham Cathedral when the Bishop of Durham questioned the virgin birth or something. There was a lightning strike and the thing was gone. So yes, these things happen. Now you might, as philosophers, say they are coincidence, and people of faith say they are evidence of some higher being, yes? Which is fine. What I want to say is that I'm sure you have come across Iqbal's reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. In one of these lectures, he takes on these issues of evidentialism, on the different proofs or approaches to proofs of God. So the ontological proof and this proof and that proof. And he finds all of them wanting in terms of definitive, outcome. And I find that all of the people who have gone that route, they then go towards mysticism to provide some kind of, not an answer, but some kind of a framework in which they could analyze this. Any thoughts on this for this Fideism?
So it reminds me, I'm not so familiar with Iqbal, but it reminds me of an anecdote or a couplet from Maulana Rumi. So pay istidlalian chubin bovad, pay chubin sakht bi tamkin bovad. So the foundations of the logicians are brittle or wooden, and wooden foundations are very brittle. So he didn't agree with the logical method either. And of course he was very mystical. So that's one example. The other example is Ghazali. So in his autobiography, Munqidhu min ad-dalal, Deliverance from Error, he says that he was a very prestigious professor. So he was teaching Kalam, had experience of Kalam, he had experience of philosophy. And then there was also the Batiniya, the Ismaili people who had, which is his secret doctrines. But he chose the Sufi path. So yes, people get fed up of philosophy sometimes, and they do look to other solutions. The philosophy is good at giving questions, but not at answers. And so people that figure that out, they go looking for the answers.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, so if I can ask a question. So you mentioned evidence, but is there not a problem at deciding what evidence constitutes of? So if we take, for example, Hume's arguments, his argument against induction, Ghazali provides the same argument in his Incoherence of the Philosophers. And so he says that basically, how can we even trust our sense perceptions? How can we trust what we're seeing? Because, well, we know that it's happened in the past, but how do we know that it continues into the future as well? And so he says it's illogical to essentially believe our sense perceptions. So if we're using sense perceptions as evidence, and that in itself is illogical by Hume's argument, who is one of the analytical, well, I don't know if he would actually fall under analytic philosophy, but he does that not then become a problem? So how do we decide what actually constitutes our evidence? And don't we have to begin to formulate a metaphysics before we can constitute what is evidence?
This is one of the major problems of philosophy, and it's occupied people for the past 2,000 years, at least in Western thought. So the issue is, how can we know anything at all? And so the job of philosophers is to argue that we can know things. We can trust our perceptions. We can trust our inferences. You know, the sun rose today, it rose the day before, it rose the day before that, and it will continue to rise forevermore. But as investors know, past performance doesn't necessarily indicate future performance. So yes, induction breaks down. And to go into a solution now would be a bit difficult, but there are people that are skeptical, and philosophers tend to renounce them. Personally, I'm probably more, at least philosophically speaking, more sympathetic to skeptical people, because they're more consistent. And if we look into Greek skepticism, although they show that it's all ridiculous, you know, we can't trust anything. You know, there's optical illusions, so how do we know we're not subject to them? Or how do we know we're not a brain in a vat, or a person in a matrix? All these sort of possibilities that find cultural expression. Well, if we're going to play this game, then we don't know anything for sure. So we have to think of a different epistemology, a different way of arranging our beliefs, and then we can maybe talk to skeptics. We just have to play a different game altogether, I think.
Okay, we'll take the last question from Jamil Uncle.
So I'm often struck in the references in the Quran when even prophets are in the quest for certainty. So, for example, you have the phrase "mutmainna qalbi," you know, in the case of Prophet Ibrahim. Even I think in the case of the disciples of Jesus, when they asked for the table, it's also again because the reason they say we want to have certainty in our hearts. So it seems like a natural quest. I don't know whether you have any reflections on that.
So the Hawariyun, the companions, the disciples, so I don't think they're held up as models of piety or models to follow in the Quran. They're not prophets. But Prophet Ibrahim, of course, is. So I don't have any immediate reflections, but I guess I'll think about that a bit more. But of course, it does seem very human, you know, to seek certainty. But then for prophets, I would have thought they have a different level of knowledge altogether that's more immediate and not acquired through evidence, but just immediate to their hearts. And so that is more certain, as certain as it could be. And I think that's more normal for prophets.
That you have action based on weight or skepticism. That action will not be decisive. Action based on certainty is obviously different order. So, you know, if you look at the early the Prophet says, okay, we're going to defend ourselves, right? And they say maybe, yes, no, then it wouldn't happen. They just go.
So you need conviction.
Yeah. If you take even on this part, then nobody will do anything.
Well, exactly. There was something I wanted to say about evidentialists. So the way that they see it is that one argument for the existence of God, it might not be that strong. But then with another one and another one, it gets stronger and stronger. So if we have one leaky bucket, then we put it in another leaky bucket. And if we put them in another leaky bucket, well, all the holes, they sort of cover each other up. Yeah, so you manage to hold water. So these evidentialists, that's how they think. So But yeah, I agree. We need something we need to think about religious beliefs in a different way.
Okay, we have reached prayer time, so I think we'll have to end there. Thank you very much, Amir. Salawat.
Thank you.